an honor and a privilege to be here with you today and to have Rabbi Burt Jacobson as our first guest on the interview show, which doesn't yet have a name, with Rabbi Jonathan Seidel. So please sit back, enjoy yourself, stay on mute, and we're going to have an exciting hour ahead of us. Thanks, everybody. Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you, Lorelei, our dear wizardess of Zoom, the catalyst for the Aquarian Minyan Yeshiva. She bopped me on the head a few weeks ago and said, "You're the Rosh Yeshiva of a yeshiva online." I thought it was a good idea. I didn't know what it meant, but thank you, Lorelei, for all your tech work and your background, your brilliance, and your devotion to Yiddishkeit and to Jewish Renewal, to the Aquarian Minyan. Thank you, thank you. So I'm delighted to initiate a new program, like a TV show, Hollywood Squares of Jewish Renewal, as it were, where we're going to interview a lot of different people over the next year on the origins of Jewish Renewal thinking and thought, what we call Neo-Hasidism. What does that mean? Modern Jewish thinking. And I'm privileged to have as my first guest, we're going to have many guests over the next year, probably once a month, maybe more. I'm delighted to welcome my teacher, one of my teachers, Rabbi Burt Jacobson, who was my Mesader Kedushin. He married Linda and I together in 1987. Thank you, Rabbi Burt, for that beautiful, with 7 rabbis there. And even though we divorced, we bless each other every day. We have a new grandchild last week, so that came out of that. And so I'm now a Zaidi, by the way. This is my initial Zaidi week. So Rabbi Burt, you're here. I just wanted to start with a nigun for those of you that like nigunim, okay? Ay, 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 ay. So welcome everybody. It's so delighting to see all your punims, beautiful faces. I'd like to start off with the first question, Rabbi Burt, and then we'll move into some others. What would you consider to be the renewal of Judaism in the last 100 years or so? What does that mean, renewal? What does it mean to renew Judaism?
Very good question. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for this interview. And blessings.
Need to be louder, please.
Oh,
Yeah, Burt, you'll have to speak up a little more. Let's get that audio going a little louder.
let's see. How is this?
It's not great, but it's better. It was fine before for some reason.
Well, I'll try to speak louder then.
Yeah, it's the audio setting. Yeah. Everybody has to turn up their.
Or just closer to the microphone.
Yeah, it was fine before, but okay. Go ahead.
The word renewal is, oh, here comes Diane. She's going to try it.
Where's your key, your audio key?
My audio key? I have no idea.
Yeah, the audio setting went down. It was okay a half hour ago, but we need to get it up.
It's at full.
Yeah, now wait, that's better. That's better.
Just sit really close to the computer and
Okay.
There we go.
The word Jewish renewal came into American Jewish parlance in the 1980s. But there were Jewish thinkers using that term beforehand Martin Buber used that term. Abraham Heschel used that term. Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine, also used the term. It seems that there was a sense that in the 20th century, Judaism needed to undergo some kind of change because all of the factors that had affected modern Judaism since the time of the emancipation of Jews in Europe had driven Jewish spirituality underground. And for many of us, without the dimension of the spiritual, what's left really? I mean, Jewish identity, Jewish politics, Jewish sociology, and that's not enough. And to my knowledge, it was Rabbi Arthur Waskow who introduced the word Jewish renewal into our modern vocabulary in the 1980s with his book, These Scattered Sparks, These Holy Sparks. That's when the word renewal started picking up. And then Rabbi Lawrence Kushner retitled one of his first books using the word renewal in the subtitle of the book. But as I said, the word renewal has roots that go back even farther. But that's what I consider to be my lineage. And because I was a student of Abraham Joshua Heschel for 4 years, and because of, I was really a disciple of Art Green when we were in the Jewish Theological Seminary Rabbinical School together. Those people are a very important part of my lineage as well.
Thank you. You mentioned Martin Buber.
Yeah.
Buber revived interest in Hasidism in the early 20th century with a book in German, Tales of the Hasidim. It seemed to have an enormous impact in Europe. And I'm wondering to what extent you see Buber as an influence for you, both in terms of the revival of Hasidism, but also Buber's interpersonal psychology. In what sense did Buber play a role for you when you were a rabbinical student? And then we'll get into Heschel in a little bit, but how important is Buber to you and why?
Buber did not play a big role in my life when I was young. I read I and Thou, I read the Tales of the Hasidim as a rabbinical student, but my heart wasn't centered on his work at that time. It really happened later on. I have to say this, I grew up in a Jewishly ethnic home without any religion at all. If whatever Judaism existed, it was because I brought it in because of what I was learning in Hebrew school. But in my late adolescence, I became quite frum. I became extremely religious, very narrow-minded, very much, and I would use this word today, addicted to halacha as the Jewish path. Very restrained. And I wound up training as a conservative rabbi. I was at the seminary for 7 years. When I busted out of that, and I busted out of it in large part because of my experiences with psychedelics in the 1960s. When I broke free, and I left Boston and came out to California, I lived without Judaism essentially for 3 or 4 years. I came back to Judaism because studying the works of Rav Kook, I saw that he was a teacher of spiritual experience, of mysticism, unlike so many other teachers. And what he was talking about is something that I experienced through psychedelics. Mm-hmm. Rav Kook did not really, though, offer me a derech. He didn't offer me a way in. He didn't talk about mystical practices. My teacher, Abraham Heschel's last book, called A Passion for Truth, was about 2 teachers that were his biggest influences, the Baal Shem Tov and the Kotzker Rebbe. That book, when I was living in the Haight-Ashbury, I was smoking a lot of weed, occasionally studying a little bit of Rav Kook. But when I read Heschel's book and what he said about the Baal Shem Tov, it just blew me away. That's what turned me on to the Baal Shem Tov. I hadn't known that Heschel had been that powerfully influenced by the Baal Shem Tov through his father, through his own father in Warsaw. I'm getting to Buber.
Okay, we'll go back to Heschel.
Your question. But I have to give this as a kind of a preface.
Okay.
When I started to study the Baal Shem, I found out that he had many different mystical and spiritual practices that he had offered his disciples, and his disciples wrote them down. This was exciting to me. But the question of halacha was still, I was not going to go back to halacha. It had been a kind of a suit of armor that I wore for many years, but it had also enchained me in ways that did not allow me to grow. What replaces halacha? I found the answer in Martin Buber. I started reading. I had already moved to Berkeley, and I had joined the Aquarian Minyan about 7 months after it had gotten started by Zalman. And the early teachers, Reb Berry, Reb Menucha Gleich, and Yehudit Goldfarb. She was Judith Wallach at the time.
She's on the call, I think.
And I was on my own. I was trying to figure out what's going to replace halacha for me. And I started reading Martin Buber. what I discovered with Buber was that for him, I mean, he had grown up in a religious home. He lived with his grandparents who were Orthodox. But when he went to the university and he saw what was available in terms of study and knowledge, he wanted a freer approach to Judaism for himself. Of course, he wound up writing I and Thou, but that was in the 1920s. That was later on. He discovers Hasidism at the turn of the century, really. He started writing books on Hasidism in 1905. He actually brought Hasidism to universal attention. He brought it to the West. He started translating Hasidic stories, Reb Nachman, the Baal Shem Tov, and he saw, he had been exposed to Eastern religion in the 1890s and to Christian mysticism at the same time. He starts to see that there's something really profound in Hasidism and that it needs to come to the attention of spiritual seekers all over the world. And that he took that on as one of his tasks, not the only one. But he rejected orthodoxy. He rejected the rigidity of the halachic system. And he came to understand that one could have a direct connection with the divine, and one could become autonomous as a human being, not subject to the authority of tradition, and still connect to God, and still come to understand what God wanted of an individual. In other words, he connected to the divine within himself. He would not have put it this way, but he connected to the divine within himself. And he began to see that if one really learns to pay attention to what's going on in every situation, one can see in whatever one is doing, one can understand that every situation, one can discern the voice of God asking you a question. How do you respond spiritually in every situation of your life? Mm-hmm. That became for him the substitute or the new way of being a religious Jew. And maybe that's the beginning of Jewish renewal. I don't know.
Well, certainly the idea of autonomy versus heteronomy is profoundly part of Jewish renewal. Yeah. But autonomy means subjecting yourself to a new ethic that comes out of autonomy, not just do what you want to do. There's a relationship to the divine, yes? There's a connection, mitzvah, connection. Heschel did not like Buber. I mean, they corresponded. They knew they worked with each other. Heschel says, na'aseh v'nishma. First, I will do the halakha, and then I will understand it. And the halakha gives me a spiritual path.
It's actually a little more complicated, Jonathan.
Right. Well, tell me how you understand Heschel's notion of halakha, because I wrestled between Buber and Heschel in those very years. They both spoke to me about a heteronymous system and an autonomous system of doing Jewish life and law and spirituality.
You know, Heschel had enormous respect for Buber. There were 20 years between them, so Heschel was much younger than Buber. But when Heschel left Warsaw, he also really left orthodoxy. I think that was part of the reason he had to leave the Hasidic community. He wanted to go into the broader world. He went to the University of Berlin. He maintained his Jewish authenticity toward the tradition his entire life. But when he encountered Buber, he found someone who saw the future of Hasidism, even though Heschel knew more about Hasidism than Buber did, because he grew up as a Hasid, he saw that Buber had a way of renewing Hasidism for the masses, for larger numbers of people. And they had a tangled relationship. When Heschel wrote his dissertation at the University of Berlin on the prophets, and Heschel was really, he had this notion that somehow the prophets could speak, that God could speak through the prophets. The prophets had a kind of an empathy, and Buber didn't take to that. Buber's notion of God changed during Buber's life, but Buber was not a biblical Jew. But Buber loved the Bible, but he wasn't a biblical Jew the way Heschel was. And Buber criticized what Heschel was doing. Heschel was strong enough, and he maintained his position. But during the Holocaust, Buber was invited to teach at the Hebrew University in 1939. He left Germany and he went to Eretz Yisrael, and he started teaching at the Hebrew University. But Heschel was working to finish his doctorate. He couldn't really leave Europe until he finished his doctorate, because he wouldn't have been able to get a teaching position in any university or seminary without a PhD. And he risked his life. He stayed until he left 6 weeks before the destruction of the war of the Warsaw Ghetto.
I thought he went to London.
Yes, went to London for a year before he was invited to teach at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and that saved his life. But during those years when Heschel was caught in Europe, he and Buber were corresponding every week. And Buber was trying to keep Heschel's spirits up. He was concerned about Heschel. So, all right, so they disagreed with one another theologically and in many other ways. But, when Buber died in 1964 or 65. Heschel was in Jerusalem at the time, and he was interviewed by the New York Times, I believe. We know, Dr. Heschel, that you disagreed a lot with Martin Buber. What do you think his legacy was? And Heschel said, I've never met a man as erudite as Martin Buber. What a mind, and what an ability to recast Judaism for a new time.
Mm-hmm.
So he expressed that kind of admiration for a man who he considered to be one of his teachers.
Right. So let's turn to Heschel for a moment. What is it you study with Abraham Joshua Heschel, Olav Sholem? Tell us how he influenced you, what you loved about him, where you disagreed.
Sure. Okay.
How you left him, how he continued to influence you, please.
Well, I entered the seminary in 1959. My first class with Heschel was a seminar in the Prophets. He had just finished the manuscript for the Prophets. So this was 1961. Heschel had been involved in thinking about issues of race in the United States in the 1950s. And thinking about issues of justice, and thinking about the sleepiness of Americans towards these profound issues. And so he went back to his dissertation, which he had done in Germany on the prophets, and he rewrote it in English. And it's really interesting that someone who grew up as a Hasid in a family that wasn't particularly political, Heschel latched on to the legacy of the prophets in the Bible, and not just their connection with God and how they were channeling God, but the questions of justice and compassion and empathy, the questions of how the little people in society get screwed by the monarchy, by the priests, by the rich people. And he wrote a book that I think will be eternally relevant, The Prophets. A major book in which has served generations now of rabbis and ministers and priests and people throughout Western society who want to understand what the Jewish gift is to tending to the cultivation of a moral society. And the book is absolutely radical. Maybe it was the time that it was written, but that first seminar with Heschel had a profound influence on me. Subsequently, I took other classes with him. I studied Yehuda Halevi with him. I had my first class in mysticism with him. My senior year, I was in a small seminar with Heschel, with Art Green, and a few other students. and that I had more personal contact with Heschel that way. And, you know, it left its imprint on me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long answer to a short question.
Yes, thank you. Because some people who study with Heschel remain quite halachic. You know, I know many of my colleagues who are conservative rabbis are pretty strictly halachic. They like mysticism a little, but it's not their thing. But they relate more strongly to Heschel's prophetic and social justice work. You know, he said, praying with Martin Luther King, his work with King, the civil rights movement, the Jewish Black Alliance, they relate to that Heschel, the one that marched, right? They're not so interested in the mystical Heschel, the one that wrote about the Kierkegaard or the Kutzker or the Best. So interesting how people have moved. Michael Lerner, of course, influenced by both sides. We'll interview Rabbi Lerner in this series.
Yeah.
That Michael was influenced by both, as have I. Heschel was my biggest influence, aside from Reb Zalman, theoretically. And Eugene Borowitz, by the way, in the Reform movement, who integrated philosophy of autonomy and ethics. Eugene Borowitz had a profound influence on me. I don't know, you know about Rabbi Borowitz's work, I assume. So I'm curious how you continued to be influenced by Heschel, and if that played a role in your founding of Kehila. Was Heschel's work influential in your founding Kehila or your involvement with the Minyan politically in any way?
Profoundly.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that question too. And you know, Michael Lerner was a personal student of Heschel's. And I've only learned recently from Michael that it was Heschel who taught Michael about the Baal Shem Tov. So.
Okay. Beautiful. Well, go ahead.
By the time I got out to the Bay Area, I'd already been involved in Jewish Renewal on the East Coast. We didn't use the term, but Art Green started Chavurah Shalom in Boston, which was the first Chavurah of the alternative culture. And most of us involved in it were traditionally oriented, but we wanted to see a renewal of tradition. And there were many people I shouldn't say many, but there were a large number of people involved in Chavurah Shalom in Boston who were also involved in radical politics. For me, the most important one was Rabbi Everett Gendler. And Everett Gendler, I consider Everett Gendler Reb Zalman's equal in founding the Jewish Renewal movement. And people don't know about Everett.
Mm-mm.
And Everett's still alive, he's in his 90s now. Everett was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And already in the 60s, Everett was a feminist. He's the founder of the Jewish environmental movement. He's the founder of Jewish pacifism. He already had integrated politics and spirituality in a deep way. He was living in Argentina during the coup, working with Rabbi Marshall Myers. He was a person to be reckoned with. Mm-hmm. He made the connection between Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr.
Wow.
And Everett never tooted his horn. So a lot of people don't know about him and don't know what his contributions were to Jewish Renewal. But they were really profound, as I'm telling you. And so Everett was a mentor of mine. Mm-hmm. In some ways, even more so than Heschel at the time. So I had that integration by the time I moved out to California.
Mm-hmm.
And when I joined the Minyan, I had the feeling almost from the beginning that there was something missing in the Minyan. That the social dimension, the political dimension, which was so profound for me, didn't seem to be there. People were really attracted by the spirituality that Reb Salman represented, but there was not a lot of knowledge about the Jewish community as a whole, about issues around Israel and Palestine. I'm not faulting people. People were new to Judaism at the time. I attempted to bring a political dimension to the Minyan and really failed at the time, which is part of the reason that I started Kehila. It wasn't the entire reason, but it certainly was part of the reason. I got a lot from the Minyan in those years, and I think I gave some important things.
You certainly did. Baruch Hashem. Thank you.
But
What?
I don't know, I think I wandered away from your question.
Well, it's okay. The wandering is okay. Once upon a time, there was a rabbi that wandered over the hills, and he knew not where he was going, but the journey was an education. So what I wanted to turn to now is the journey of liturgy. So you got involved with the Minyan. You come from Chavarat Shalom. How is it you came to write more feminist-oriented liturgies, gender-balanced language? Where did this Hebrew-English liturgical shift with you happen? You know, was it Jules Harlow at JTS that influenced you on that? Who are the poetic influences that really turned your head towards new English about davening and prayer? I'm curious.
That's a terrific question too. Yeah, I throughout my rabbinic education, I was really interested in davening and in liturgy, and I got involved in the conservative movement's liturgy project, working with Rabbi Jules Harlow. In fact, in my senior year, I was invited to come onto the faculty at JTS and teach liturgy and to be at the head of all conservative liturgical publication.
Wow.
I decided not to do that because 7 years at the seminary, and I had a very large amount of anger around a lot of stuff that went on at the seminary and around the kind of education that I got or didn't get. So I decided not to stay. But I still had that interest. And at Chavarat Shalom from 1968 to 1970, I did start experimenting. I started looking at modern Hebrew poets, modern Yiddish poets, and I realized, well, if we were still living in a religious civilization, the great modern Hebrew and Yiddish poets, they'd be writing liturgy. So I started looking for poetry written by modern writers that expressed something deeply spiritual, and we started experimenting with this at Chavarat Shalom. It didn't go that far. When I was part of the Aquarian Minyan, though, the dam had busted, and I didn't feel that I was halachically required to keep the Mabea Tefillah, the traditional structure of the prayer service, that we could begin to experiment. I was really influenced by Arthur Waskow's Freedom Seder. What Arthur did in the Freedom Seder was he took the traditional text And he looked at it from a contemporary point of view, and he rewrote it. And I said to myself, well, why can't we do that? Why can't we rewrite the liturgy? I had 3 critiques of the traditional liturgy. One was a feminist critique, because God is always he, everything is in the masculine. And I was already headed toward feminism in the late 1960s. That's a whole other story. But I also felt that the Jewish liturgy was too ethnically centered on Jews alone. I no longer believed in the chosen people idea. That the Jews were at the center of humanity. And I felt that the traditional liturgy was dangerous in keeping alive an idea about the Jewish people, a triumphalist idea about the Jewish people that really needed to go. I became convinced of the Palestinian cause by 1971. And I saw how Jewish chauvinism and triumphalism, Reb Zalman called it triumphalism, how dangerous this was, as all nationalisms are. And I've been an anti-nationalist my entire life. And I felt that the liturgy had to express our connections with humankind and the fact that all human beings are made in the divine image. And we couldn't have a liturgy any longer that just focused on the Jewish people alone. So these were some of the reasons that I started working on new liturgy. And people in the Aquarian Minyan were very open to this and to experimentation. I have to say that I felt very guilty doing this at the time. I still had all those voices of my seminary professors, internalized to say, you can't change the liturgy, that blah, 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 blah. And I struggled with it, and I was in therapy dealing with some of these issues, and I just went ahead and did what I felt I needed to do so I could daven, and other people in the minyan could have a liturgy which would be more comfortable and would express their own soul needs.
Beautiful. I want to acknowledge some of the liturgists and songwriters in this room today. Kol hakavod to you. May you be blessed to continue to write and sing and write poetry. All of you that know who you are, I read your poetry. Songwriters, liturgists, right in this room today. Look around the room, okay? I don't need to mention names, but there's some outstanding writers in the room. Many of us were influenced by you, Burt. I was, and other poetic influences. I also am in therapy from my traumatic years at JTS too, 40 years later when I left. I went through Jewish Theological Seminary for 4 years, and then I fled to the Aquarian Minyan. It was a radical shift. But in New York, they whispered the name Aquarian Minyan to me, and I came to do my doctorate at UC Berkeley and met you, thank God. So the writing of Jewish liturgy continues today. New poetry, new Kabbalistic poetry, new experience-centered, with respect to the Seder, with respect to tradition. As Kaplan said, it has a vote, not a veto. Same thing with halacha. And I'm curious today what you're working on. We have a little more time to talk about the Besht and how the Baal Shem Tov has been a central figure in your life since the 70s. So if you would tell us what you're working on and why the Baal Shem Tov is such an important historical figure or legendary figure for you, or all of us.
Right.
Please, I know this is a whole other hour really on the Baal Shem Tov, so we'll bring you back. But if you could start us off with a little bit about why the Baal Shem is so important for Jewish life and renewal.
Sure.
for your life and experience, please.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was really introduced to the Baal Shem by Heschel's book, A Passion for Truth. And Heschel had a particular attitude toward the Baal Shem Tov. He actually says that there was no teacher since Moses like the Baal Shem Tov. That was his evaluation.
No Rambam in there? No Maimonides?
He wrote a book on Maimonides also.
Yeah.
Heschel was working on a biography of the Baal Shem Tov. There was an arson attempt. There were several arson attempts on the seminary in the last 2 years that I was there, 65 and 66. All of Heschel's research on the Baal Shem Tov was in the rare books collection. It all burnt in the arson attempt. And so he could not write his book on the Baal Shem. But what he says in A Passion for Truth is that if Moshe Rabbeinu, if Moses was the channel for the Torah, the Baal Shem Tov did something no other Jew before him had done. He created a new people. Because somehow the Baal Shem understood the trauma that the Jewish people had undergone through the centuries, and especially the traumas that they experienced in the 17th century. In the middle of the 17th century, there were pogroms that killed at least 13,000 Jews in Poland. Take that in. And there were only 1 million Jews around that time, according to the demography. So that's a huge proportion of Jews who were destroyed in these Polish pogroms. And I believe that the Jewish people never recovered from that. The asceticism, the self-wounding that Jews were engaged in the world that the Baal Shem grew up in, the sadness, the depression, the divisions between Jews, the fact that the scholars and the rabbis were elitist and they didn't really care about the poor people and the common laborers, the people who needed to work just to get along. And I think the Baal Shem saw this and saw that this woundedness needed healing. And his work testifies, and the founding of Hasidism testifies to the kind of engagement he had with this issue.
What about his ecstatic experiences, his trip to heaven, his conversations with angels, the healing remedies, things portrayed in the Shivchei HaBesht? Did you find those inspirational? Are they today?
They weren't initially something I was interested in. I was interested in him as a mystic. What was powerful to me was his recognition that there's no place where the divine doesn't exist. I had already found that in Eastern religion, especially in the Vedanta traditions of India, in Taoism, in Zen, and to find it articulated the way the Baal Shem articulated it was extremely powerful for me. But as I studied the Baal Shem more and more, I saw that he was not only a mystic, he was a shaman as well. And shamans are not mystics. It's a very different,
Mhm.
it's a very different
Right.
way of understanding the world. Shamanism goes back to the Paleolithic era. It's the oldest form of religion.
Right.
And as I investigated and studied about this, I saw that I had to learn more about the Baal Shem as a shaman as well.
Good. Will you be dealing with the psychedelics and shamanism in your book about the best?
I will actually, because there have been a few scholarly attempts to try to show that the Baal Shem was exposed to psychedelics. This is not something that can be proven, but there's enough circumstantial evidence to make a case for it.
That's another whole hour I want to talk to you about, because I work a lot on shamanism.
Sure.
And when I'm in an altered state of consciousness, I just know the best was tripping. It's a known thing, right, experientially. So I'd like to hear more about that at another time. I am curious about your book. We don't have that much time left to talk about the book. I'm very excited for you to finish the book someday. And you know, a 400 or 500 page book on the Baal Shem Tov.
Yeah.
Bless you to finish it, my dear rabbi, friend, and teacher. We can have more conversations about the details of the Besh life, his experiences, some of the teachings that come in the Shifchei and other traditions. Another hour, okay, if you'll come back for us on that. I do want to start opening up this wonderful conversation. Thank you to some of our amazing people on the call. And just raise your hand if you want to ask Rabbi Burt a question or comment on. Some of you are historical figures in the Aquarian Minyan in this very room. Founders, you're historical figures in your own right and deserve an interview. I have questions for you as well. And so I have the honor as a visiting rabbi of the Aquarian Minyan to ask Minyan members and anybody else who's on this call to raise their hand with a question for our dear rabbi. Miriam first from Arizona.
Yeah, so I just want to say I have to leave this. I have another meeting in 2 minutes.
Yeah, Miriam.
So I just want to, thank Burt, just like Burt was talking about all the people that inspired him. Before I leave, I have to just say how much what he did inspired me and inspired David, and inspired so many people afterwards in terms of taking the foundation that he created and continuing to move forward with that in terms of the liturgy. So thank you so much, and I have to leave now.
Have a good day, Miriam. Be well. Thank you too for your work for the Minyan. Thank you so much. One of our early young stars back in the 70s. Still, all these, I was a youngster when I met some of you, by the way. I was 25 years old.
I have a question. May I ask a question?
Miriam had
Okay, sure.
First, Arizona.
Okay, thank you. I didn't realize an hour had passed. I thought it was 10 minutes.
Right.
So, but my question is, how did it happen that the followers of the Baal Shem have morphed into so many rigid sects today?
You mean in terms of the dynasties being ultra-Orthodox and clear and strict? Yeah, oh, that's a great question, yeah.
That is a good question. Well, let me say this. The Baal Shem Tov was a radical in his time. But what he introduced apparently was fine for the people of his generation. But for people who were more traditional, it was too far out. And as the Baal Shem's legacy passed from generation to generation, it got encrusted and it became more and more rigid. There were 3 stages in what happened. The first stage was struggles within the Hasidic community itself, between different people who claimed to have received the authentic legacy of the Baal Shem, who were fighting against one another. Unfortunately, Reb Nachman of Wrocław was one of the people who caused some of this dissent, because he was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem, and he felt he had the true legacy, but others felt as well. The second major struggle was with the Mitnagdim, the Jews of Lithuania and White Russia, who were totally opposed to Hasidism, and they excommunicated the Hasidim. And the Hasidim fought back, and both sides were nasty towards one another. But there was a desire, like the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Shner Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad, he wanted to try to make peace with the Vilna Gaon and try to make Hasidism come back to the mainstream, but the Vilna Gaon wouldn't accept it. But gradually, as I said, it became more and more traditional. The next step was in around 1820, when the Enlightenment values of Western Europe have made their way to Eastern Europe, and secularism was on its way, and Jewish citizenship in European countries was on its way, and the Hasidim got extremely scared of the coming of modernity. And they joined with their opponents, the Mitnagdim. Suddenly it seemed like the differences between the Mitnagdim and the Hasidim weren't that great. They had to both fight the modern world. Mm-hmm. And they fought the modern world by trying to put walls up, by making halakha stricter. The capstone was the Holocaust. Those, 3 of the 6 million Jews who died were Polish Jews. Mostly Hasidim and Hasidic masters. We talk about the travails that happened in Tibet. This was our Tibet also, what happened in Poland. Mm-hmm. But those Hasidic masters who survived, who went either to Israel or to New York or a few other places, they were intent on creating Hasidism the way they had known it in Europe, once again, because that was the only authentic Judaism that there was.
Yeah.
And that's, in a very simplistic way, that's an answer to the question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. Lorelei, and then Lorelei, you had a question.
Yeah, I do. Well, it just strikes me as funny because I think anybody from what some people might call a quote unquote ultra-Orthodox background listening to this would be laughing and saying, what are you talking about? The Besht is from Sheba from. I think that there's a entire spectrum of Jewish experience today that can claim the Baal Shem Tov in some way. I think that it was an excellent analogy to say that he's in a sense like Moshe Rabbeinu, in that there's something that he offers that has, I guess I want to ask you, do you feel that he's a unifying enough figure that there's the possibility of the figure of the Baal Shem Tov, his legacy, and how it can be received by everyone from the ultra-Orthodox to the almost completely secular, very liberal end of Judaism that's completely non-observant? Do you think that there's that in the figure of the Baal Shem Tov and his legacy, is there a modern, or as postmodern as we are right now, a postmodern application of his teachings that might be a point of unity for an increasingly fragmented worldwide Jewish people? That's my question.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. Sad to say, I don't think so. Because there are many different Baal Shem Tovs. I mean, look at the Buddhist world. How many Buddhas are there? I mean, different Buddhist schools of thought disagree with one another, and they all claim to go back to the Buddha, right? What about Jesus and Christianity? How many forms of Christianity are there now? Denominations and people who claim that they're connected to the authentic Jesus, you know. This is what happens in religious traditions. The research that's been conducted about the Baal Shem Tov during the last 50 years has been deep and profound, and we know a lot more about him because of the research, the academic research. We know a lot more about what he might have contributed, what has been attributed to him, et cetera, even though the scholars are in great disagreement with one another about these things. I have my own views, other scholars have their views. One of the books I think that has attempted to bridge this is Yitzhak Buxbaum's book, The Fire and Light of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, this is a wonderful book, a wonderful collection of stories and legends. It's not very historic at all. You're not necessarily going to get the original Baal Shem by reading that book. You're going to get the legendary Baal Shem that developed in later Hasidism. Nonetheless, it is a book that more traditionally oriented people, as well as liberal people, could read and appreciate, you know, some of the streams that have gone into the image of the Baal Shem Tov over the years. I wish I could be more positive about connecting with our more traditional sisters and brothers. If somebody could show me a way, that would be terrific.
That's a tough.
We'll have to talk offline. I have ideas.
That's tough. Connecting Haredim with Jewish Renewal, I wanted to say another topic we'll deal with is all the people in the Minyan that went off into Shlomo land, the Shlomo Chevra, who became, I would say, more conservative politically about Israel. Not everybody adopted your point of view on politics in Israel-Palestine at all. We know the spectrum within the Jewish Renewal movement is actually wider than you think. So many of my friends, and I was invited to be part of the Shtachim in the late 70s, to join the Shtachim, to get married in the frum world and become a Haredi settler. Yes, the distinct possibility for me personally. I'd be living another life with 12 kids and 40 grandkids at this point, like some of my friends. So I'd be interested politically. The Besht himself is like a Rorschach, right? You can tell a lot about Jews, what they think about the Besht. And I'm curious about your book. I also read Professor Rossman's book, which is more minimalist about the Besht's existence. Professor Etkes of Hebrew U has a wonderful book on as shaman and mystic. but there's more books to be written. And more questions on other angles of Jewish renewal, liturgy, poetry, history, JTS, you name it. There's a lot here in these 80-something years. So I would ask you, have you more questions before we conclude? And we will hopefully have Rabbi Burt back too. Anybody have a good question, please? Dale, unmute yourself, sir. Yes, Dale? Yeah, we can't hear you, sir. No, we can't hear you, Dale.
Okay,
There
can you
go.
hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. The depressed state of Jewry in Europe in the 17th century, could there be some comment on the two false messiahs, on how much they created that sense of depression? Second thing that came to mind is the original Rabbi Cook. I did theses on him, as a graduate student. Has he had any influence? He seemed to be very unifying in his approach. And third, this has to do with the Lubavitch community. I actually was there with Zalman, even in the 70s, where he would go for blessings from the Rebbe. Any comment on the enormous influence of Chabad today as opposed to the other Hasidic families? So 3 things if he wants to reply to either of the 3.
Your choice. You don't have to do all, Burt, whatever you'd like.
I could reply to all of them. Let me take the last question because it involves Reb Zalman. When Reb Zalman got to this country, his father was a Belzer Chassid. He didn't grow up in such a Hasidic milieu in Austria, but in Amsterdam, he got to know some Chabadniks who were in the diamond business and were teaching him also about this. So when he got to the United States, and he was still a teenager, he walked to Brooklyn. I think he was all of 16 or 17 years old. And he met the Rebbe, It wasn't the last Rebbe, Menachem Mendel. It was
Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson.
Yeah, the previous Rebbe.
Yeah.
And he was totally taken. And he did become a Chabadnik. And in some ways, he remained that his entire life. He was a reform Chabadnik, is what he was. Jewish renewal would not have happened the way we know it without that history that Reb Zalman went through. And Reb Zalman and Reb Shlomo both became right-hand men of Menachem Mendel, the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. You don't know this probably, but Zalman, the Chabad houses was Zalman's idea. And he told us that he regretted it later on. But he gave many ideas to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe wanted, Zalman and Shlomo were influences on the Rebbe in terms of broadening the Chabad's appeal to larger number of Jews. So, that's also interesting in terms of Chabad renewal, I think, or Hasidic renewal in the Orthodox world. In 1960, I started going to Chabad in Brooklyn, 770 Eastern Parkway. And I have to tell you, I was really taken by it. I love the Farbrengens. I loved the spirit. For almost 2 years, I would be out there almost every month for Shabbos Mavorching, the blessing, the Shabbos blessing the new moon and the Fabrayans. But eventually, and they were trying to convert me. They wanted me to go to the Lubavitch Yeshiva. And I was really thinking of it because the Jewish Theological Seminary was so academic and so cold. I don't know what it is now, but and there was still fire in the Chabad environs. So I was really taken by it. But the home of the family that I would stay with Friday night and Saturday, Shabbos, when I went out there, on Friday night around the table, the host would always look at me and said, so Reb Baruch, that my Hebrew name is Baruch, Reb Baruch, what heresy did you learn at the seminary this week? What apikourses did you learn this week? So I would say something about what I learned, and he would say, oh, that's completely wrong. The Rebbe says blah, 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 blah. Well, after a year and a half or so of this, it was enough for me. I don't know, the authoritarianism, which was at the center of Chabad, was just something I could no longer abide. And I stopped going out there. I took a lot with me, but it became clear to me that I could never become a Chassid that way.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, and Dale, he addressed Rav Kook before you were on. He addressed Rav Kook. Okay, yeah. So let's have one more. Let's have one more question, please. Gloria?
Jonathan, all right. Can I get in here?
Jerry? Who's
Jonathan,
yeah.
This is Yitzhak Aron from Santa Rosa. I just want to thank you both for doing this. This has been awesome, and I have a particularly experiencing joy at seeing Ruvain and Yehudit in their stone house in Israel. And I would really like to hear what the sound bounces off the walls sounds like from there, if they would say a few words. Maybe. Yeah, say something, anything, you just, both of you.
Okay, I will. Who's in the background over there, Jerry?
I'm in Santa Rosa with my friend Lizette. We're in a house in Santa Rosa.
Very cool. Okay, so I'm in a house and spot with my wife, Yehudit, as you know. I would say, first of all, what a treat. What a treat to hear the exchange between Jonathan and Burt. Wow. It's really made my day, and I've had a long, interesting day. It's almost over. We're late at night here, but I'm quite awake. I learned a lot from listening to Burt review his life path. I knew some of this stuff already. I appreciate how clear as a bell he is, how accurate his memory is, and how clear his exposition. The last thing you said, Burt, about anti-authoritarianism, actually, that's my issue. I would say that was the one thing that I always had to check out and test out before I joined any group or checked into any kind of a scene. Is somebody running this thing, sub rosa, secretly, subterraneanly, or is there room for a person to take initiative, speak his own mind, and help shape the course of the dynamics of the group or any relationship? So that is that's what's called the deal breaker or the non-starter for me when I run into a scene where I'm not listened to because the minds have already been made up. Of course, I'm in some situations like that now. but it's different. I have flexibility. I have agency, and I have leverage. So if I accept something, I can accept it in part, and I don't have to raise an opposition or a ruckus because I can go elsewhere. I have a lot of options. So again, finally, they'll say there's a lot of options, a lot of variety in Eretz Yisrael today, in Spot in particular. Sure, there's a lot of heavy-duty Hasidic groups, but I can still walk into any shul and I'll be accepted. And we also have circles of friends who are more from renewal. Sometimes it's people who didn't know anything about renewal, but they're renewal in their hearts. I think we sent one of our close friends here, who was a free thinker, to an Aleph event in the States, and she just loved it and made friends with the teachers there, and came back again to Kala. I think she went to Ruach Arts the first time, and we've had alternative services here. It's not really that big a part of our lives right now, but our friendships have endured, and our table talk is liberated.
We welcome you back into the conversation anytime. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Always.
Okay.
One more question. We have to go. We have to create an ending to this. Gloria, yeah.
Just thank you, Rabbi Burt. And I heard a fallen away, a reference to Zalman as a fallen away Chabadnik. But of course, it was he picked up Chabad. He picked them up rather than fallen from them. Right?
Nice.
A lot of his ideas I experience now when I go to shul.
Well, Reb Zalman, he didn't really want to ever badmouth traditional Hasidism. He was a peacemaker. He was someone who wanted to embrace not just the entire Jewish people, but the entire human race and the world as a whole. So but he had to honor his own intuition. He had to honor how he felt he was being drawn by God into renewing Judaism for our time. But he didn't do it in a rebellious way. He didn't come out damning tradition. He was reasonable he was rational for a mystic. He was open-hearted, and he wanted those of us in renewal to honor the old as we were evolving it into the new. And he was a model for me to do that, because I wasn't that way. I was very rebellious. And when I broke from traditional Judaism, you could hear me cursing from one end of the world to the other about how awful, the authoritarianism and all the guilt-producing mechanisms of tradition were. So I learned more tolerance from Reb Zalman in that respect.
Beautiful. I think, folks, that's a great note to, there he is, Alav Shalom, our founder, our inspiration. My Rebbe, who ordained me, by the way.
Yard site, is
Yard site's coming up. Yes, we'll do a special program for that. I do want to thank everybody. Rabbi Burt, thank you so much. Kol hakavod.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
You can unmute. Kol hakavod, Admeyav Esrim, may you continue to teach us, inspire us, be in conversation with us. So I welcome you back to the next time we interview Rabbi Burt. We'll interview some other folks on this call too for our series in Jewish Renewal. I don't know what to call it yet, Lorelei. We'll figure it out.
We'll think of a good name.
And I welcome all of you to our yeshiva classes. We have a wonderful Kabbalist and brilliant teacher of Jewish Renewal in our room today, Reb Tamima, welcome. A great mind, a creative and innovative mind, poetic mind right here. She's going to teach for us. Ruvain and Yehudit, I hope you'll come teach for us too. It'll fit your time schedule. We'll see. I have to pay you a lot of money, I know, but we can get you there. So Reb Tamima will be teaching in August, a wonderful class in Davanology and Kabbalah. We have other great teachers we're lining up for the yeshiva. A wonderful curriculum ahead. So the Aquarian Minyan is hardly gone. It's continuing to innovate and change and grow in numbers and ideas. So we welcome you to all our programs.
I'll be teaching, this is Sarah, I'll be teaching tomorrow at noon, ritual, blessing, spirituality, and healing. It's 3rd of 3 classes, but you don't need to have been to the other 2 to come. And God willing, I'll be feeling a little bit better than I have been. Ruvain and Yehudit, it's nice to see you. I don't know if you heard, but I've been having coronavirus. So,
yeah, we want to pray for Reb Sarah and all the others that are sick with this horrible thing.
Yeah.
Okay, Refuah Shlema, Reb Sarah.
All right. I look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. And also our beloved Diane Elliott, who's here on this call, who just happens to be here because she's related to Burt. And she's a Burt fangirl, I'm pretty sure, is teaching on Mondays. This coming Monday is another class in her continuing series on the Torah of Summer. And really, it's a wonderful series about our relationship to the concept of failure and what happens to us when we fail. And it's really just a huge, huge opportunity for growth. We have a ton of classes coming up, and you should go to our website, aquarianminyan.org, for the full list of everything that we're doing, and come back and see us again. And Rabbi Burt, you have an open invitation to come back at any time, and offline we really will get you back for a part 2. I hope we didn't wear you out too much, because I know we could keep you going all day long, but we're going to have mercy on you and all of us and say goodbye in a minute here. I'm going